Early quiet afternoon, the 4th of July, 1941. A formation of Bristol Blenheim light bombers crosses the Norfolk coast and drops down over the North Sea until their propellers are close enough to the water to throw spray. There is not a cloud anywhere in the sky, which for a raid like this one is the worst possible news. No cover, no concealment, nothing to hide 15 aircraft from anyone who happens to look up between the English coast and the middle of Germany. At the front of the formation, in a Blenheim-coded GB-D, serial V6028, sits Wing Commander Huey Edwards, an Australian officer of the Royal Air Force leading 9 aircraft of his own No. 105 Squadron, and 6 more from No. 107 Squadron. The target is Bremen, one of the most heavily defended ports in the Reich. The plan is not to fly high and hope. The plan is to fly so low that German gun crews will have almost no warning and almost no time to track a target streaking past at 50 feet, skimming telephone wires and high-tension cables the whole way in. It is, on paper, either a very good idea or a very short one, and nobody involved will know which until they are over the target itself. This is the story of Operation Wreckage, the raid that earned Huey Edwards the Victoria Cross, and the story of why, in the summer of 1941, Bomber Command sent unescorted light bombers across the width of Germany in broad daylight at all, when every lesson of the previous year's fighting over France had already shown, in blood, exactly what daylight bombing without fighter cover tended to cost. Part 1. Why daylight and why now? To understand why anyone ordered 15 Blenheims into Germany in full sunlight, you have to look at the calendar rather than the aircraft. On the 22nd of June, 1941, Germany had invaded the Soviet Union. Within 2 weeks, a substantial part of the Luftwaffe's fighter strength that had spent the previous year over the Channel and southern England was moving east, following the Army Group commanders into Russia. For Winston Churchill and the air staff, this was a moment that would not last, and they wanted something visible done with it. Bomber Command's main weapon against Germany in the summer of 1941 was still the night offensive, Wellingtons and the first of the 4-engined heavies searching for cities in the dark with navigation and bombing accuracy that would not be seriously fixed for another 2 years. Night raids were relentless, but they were also, in the summer of 1941, quiet in a political sense. They happened somewhere over Germany after dark, and were reported the next morning as a number of aircraft dispatched and a number missing. What Churchill wanted, with a large part of the Luftwaffe's fighter strength suddenly absent, was something that could be seen and reported as it happened. A strike at the heart of the Reich, by day, while Germany was looking the other way. That strategic decision landed on No. 2 Group, Bomber Command's daylight formation, and specifically on the Bristol Blenheim, the light bomber that had entered RAF service in 1937 as a fast, twin-engine design capable of carrying a modest bomb load a useful distance. By the summer of 1941, the Blenheim was no longer fast by the standards of German fighters, and it had already paid an appalling price for daylight work over France in the collapse of 1940, when whole formations had been cut down, attacking bridgeheads in conditions the aircraft was never built to survive. What it still had, a year later, was range, reasonable numbers, and, on a day when the German fighter screen over Northern Europe was thinner than it had been in a year, a plausible chance of getting a formation to a target and back if the approach itself could be made survivable. Bomber Command's answer to that problem, on this particular operation, was to fly so low that height itself became a form of cover. No. 2 Group had spent the best part of a year experimenting with exactly this idea in smaller doses, shipping strikes off the Dutch and French coasts, single aircraft raids on power stations and factories, low-level attacks intended to hit precise industrial targets that night bombing in 1941 simply could not find in the dark. None of those earlier operations had the scale or the political intent of what was planned for Bremen. This was not a raid meant to slip past the enemy unnoticed. It was meant to be noticed by Berlin, by London, and by an ally that did not yet exist as a co-belligerent, but was, from the 22nd of June onward, fighting the same enemy on a front large enough to draw the Luftwaffe's fighters away from the Channel coast. Part 2. The aircraft, the squadrons, and the crew of GB-D. The Blenheim Mark IV carried a crew of 3, a pilot, an observer who doubled as bomb aimer and navigator, and a wireless operator who also manned the gun position, and could reach a little over 250 miles an hour with just over 1,000 pounds of bombs carried internally. 2 squadrons were assigned to this operation, both based in Norfolk. Number 105 Squadron at Swanton Morley, and Number 107 Squadron flying from Great Massingham, a satellite airfield of RAF West Raynham. Between them, they put up 15 aircraft for the 4th of July, 9 from 105 Squadron and 6 from 107 Squadron, with the whole formation under the command of Wing Commander Huey Edwards of 105 Squadron. Edwards was 30 years old, born in Fremantle, Western Australia, and already an experienced squadron commander by the summer of 1941, having flown operationally since the early months of the war and survived a serious flying accident that had left him with a permanent limp, a detail that makes the physical demands of the raid to come slightly harder to imagine casually. In his own aircraft that afternoon flew Pilot Officer Ramsey as navigator and Sergeant G. Quinn as gunner, 2 names that would, within weeks, appear alongside Edwards' own in the official recognition for this operation. As the formation leader, Edwards carried a double responsibility that afternoon, flying his own aircraft through the same wires, cables, and flak as everyone else, while also holding 14 other crews on his wing through a route that allowed for almost no deviation and no second attempt. Edwards held the formation tight on the outbound leg across the North Sea, low enough that the aircraft were skimming the wave tops, before the Blenheims crossed into occupied Europe just south of Cuxhaven and turned south for Bremen, where the tight formation was intended to loosen into a line abreast so that individual crews could pick their own aiming points over the docks and shipyards rather than bombing as a single, tightly packed target for the defenses. Every observer in every aircraft that afternoon was effectively doing 2 separate jobs at once, watching the ground rush past close enough to read individual rooftops, while simultaneously preparing to identify and aim at a target still several long minutes away. A workload that left almost no margin anywhere along the route for a moment's hesitation. Part 3. 50 feet, in full daylight. The route in was chosen for exactly the reason it sounds insane: to keep the Blenheims below the effective engagement height of most German early warning and gun-laying systems for as long as possible. 50 feet. A Blenheim is not flying below the radar in the way that phrase is used today. Radar barely existed on either side in a usable airborne form, but it is flying below the sight lines of a great many observers, below the angle at which anti-aircraft gunners expect a bomber to appear, and directly through obstacles that no sane, low-level plan would normally choose to fly through on purpose. Edwards' formation crossed the German coast and pressed on 50 miles overland at the same height, carrying away telephone wires, passing beneath high-tension power cables, correcting for hedgerows and church spires the entire way. The ordinary furniture of the North German countryside turned into a continuous, low-altitude obstacle course. None of that was the dangerous part. The dangerous part was Bremen itself. As the Blenheims approached the port, they had already been sighted by shipping out at sea, and Edwards knew, even before the city came into view, that the defenses ahead would not be surprised in the way the plan had hoped. There is no version of this operation, in hindsight or on the day, that ever depended entirely on stealth. The moment a single German lookout on a single trawler radioed a sighting inland, every gun crew between the coast and Bremen had several minutes' warning, and several minutes is more than enough time to man a flak battery. Bremen's approaches were guarded by a dense barrage of tethered balloons, strung specifically to force low-flying aircraft up into the effective height band of the anti-aircraft guns, and by heavy flak batteries ringing the docks and shipyards that were the actual target. Edwards took his formation straight through the balloon cables rather than climbing to go around them, trading one danger for a shorter exposure to the other, and pressed on into a curtain of anti-aircraft fire over the target itself. A balloon cable, at that speed and that height, is not a minor obstacle. It is a steel wire capable of shearing a wing clean off an aircraft that strikes it at the wrong angle, and every pilot in the formation knew it, which makes the decision to fly through the barrage rather than climb over it and lose the low-level cover that had brought them this far the single most consequential judgment call of the entire operation. Every single Blenheim in that formation was hit by something before the run was over. 4 of them did not come home at all. Edwards' own aircraft, V-6028, was struck more than 20 times, and by his own account and that of his crew, held together only by the sort of stubborn mechanical luck that turns up in exactly this kind of story, often enough to be a genuine feature of the war rather than a storyteller's embellishment. He held the formation together on the run over the target, allowed his crews to bomb, and then brought the survivors home across the North Sea, low again, nursing damaged aircraft back across a stretch of open water that offered no help to anyone who went down in it. Part 4. The verdict, and what it actually changed. 3 weeks later, on the 22nd of July, 1941, Huey Edwards was awarded the Victoria Cross for the Bremen raid, the official recognition noting that he had led his force through fierce anti-aircraft fire that hit every aircraft and destroyed 4 of them, made a successful attack regardless, and withdrew the survivors without further loss. His navigator, Pilot Officer Ramsey, received the Distinguished Flying Cross for the same operation, and his gunner, Sergeant Quinn, a bar to his existing Distinguished Flying Medal. It remains one of the relatively small number of Victoria Crosses awarded to Bomber Command aircrew during the entire war, and the only one earned in this particular style of raid, a daylight, low-level dash through a defended city, rather than a single dramatic act inside one aircraft. What Operation Wreckage did not do, whatever its individual heroism, was solve Bomber Command's underlying problem. A 25% loss rate, 4 aircraft out of 15, or, on some tellings, out of the 12 that actually reached the target run, was not a sustainable exchange rate for a light bomber force that could not be replaced overnight, and it was achieved on a day when the Luftwaffe's fighter defenses over northern Europe were unusually thin. Multiply that loss rate across a sustained campaign of similar raids, rather than a single showcase operation timed to coincide with a temporary gap in the German fighter screen, and the arithmetic stops working within a matter of weeks. Every squadron flying this kind of daylight low-level attack was in effect spending trained crews faster than the Empire Air training scheme and the operational conversion units behind it could replace them. And everyone at group and command level understood that, even while the newspapers reported Bremen as a triumph. Raids of this type continued through 1941 and continued to bleed the Blenheim squadrons at a rate that, added to the losses already suffered over France the previous year, meant the type's days as Bomber Command's principal daylight striking force were numbered. Within 2 years, the Blenheim had been retired from frontline bomber duty in Europe altogether, replaced in the daylight role by faster, better protected aircraft, while the night offensive that Churchill had wanted to supplement in the summer of 1941 grew into the overwhelming weight of the later war years. Edwards himself survived the war, went on to further senior RAF appointments, and after 1945 returned to Australia, where he served for a decade as Governor of Western Australia, the state where he had been born, a peacetime coda that very few of the men who flew beside him over Bremen that afternoon lived to share. The honest verdict on Bremen, then, is a split one. As an act of airmanship and courage, it stands on its own, 12 or 15 aircraft, depending on which stage of the operation you are counting, held together through wires, cables, a balloon barrage, and a curtain of flak by a formation leader who did not break contact and did not lose the aircraft he still had left. As a piece of strategic bombing doctrine, it was a demonstration of what daylight precision raiding by lightly armed bombers could achieve against a defended target when the enemy's guard was briefly down, and an equally clear demonstration of what it would cost every time the guard was up. Bomber Command drew the obvious conclusion, quietly narrowing the daylight role over the following months and shifting the weight of the offensive back toward the aircraft and the darkness that could actually absorb this kind of arithmetic. The Blenheim, still flying these missions until something better arrived, did not have that luxury. If your father, grandfather, or uncle served with number 105 or number 107 Squadron, or flew Blenheims from Swanton Morley, Great Massingham, or West Raynham, on this raid or any other, we would be glad to read their name, their rank, and their unit in the comments below. These stories survive only because families choose to keep them. Subscribe to British Bastion for more long-form British military history, the raids that worked precisely once, the doctrines that quietly changed because of them, and the men who flew them anyway, often carrying injuries and disabilities that a modern flying service would never have let anywhere near a cockpit in the first place.